In this episode, we talk about 2024 breaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming mark and what it says about our climate change preparedness. We also talk about the festival of Uttarayan and how it's helping homeowners in the walled city of Old Ahmedabad. But first, we talk about the state of the Indian economy. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, the National Statistics Office released what are called the first advance estimates of India's GDP in the current financial year. This is an annual exercise and essentially works as a forecast for what India's GDP will be by the end of March.
Now, this is obviously because the year has not ended, it's a forecast, it's an estimate.
That's the Indian Express's Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the paper.
And it is made out of the existing data that they have, maybe for 7-8 months. And they use all the other indicators that they have, plus the past trends that they have from previous years of how much GDP was up till a particular point and how much did it go beyond that. So extrapolate that to come to a particular number, which becomes the marker for everybody in the system. Most crucially for the union budget, which will be presented on the 1st of February. So you need an understanding of what the GDP would be in the current year, some kind of a working number, to use that as a marker for your calculations for next year. Because without that, you will not be able to project what overall growth and numbers would be. So that is the significance of this first advanced estimate.
Now, these estimates, which were released last week, show that the rate of growth of India's economic output has been decelerating. In fact, according to it, India's real GDP has grown at a compounded annual growth rate of just 4.8%. This is in stark contrast to the almost 7% average annual growth rate that India had seen since the 1991 economic reforms. To understand the reasons behind this deceleration, we speak to Udit in this segment. Udit, we just mentioned that the rate at which India's real GDP has been growing is low. Now we know that GDP is basically the monetary value of goods and services produced in a country. But can you tell us what is real GDP as opposed to nominal GDP, which is another way of calculating the gross domestic product?
Yes. So the first thing I think listeners need to understand is that the observed variable is nominal GDP. When we say GDP is the monetary value of all goods and services produced in the economy, then these are monetary values based on the current market prices that we have. Now, first understand that suppose an economy only produces apples and you had, 10 apples in the first year and the prices of each apple was 10 rupees, so total GDP would be 100 rupees. Now, if in the second year, there are two ways in which you can go to 200 GDP. One is that for the same 10 apples, the price is double, right? So a nominal GDP will go to 200 because each apple is now 20 rupees. But the real GDP, which is the actual goods and services that you are producing, is still 10 apples. So the other way to go to a higher GDP is that the prices of the apples still remain 10 per piece, but you now produce 20 apples. That's another way to get to 200 GDP, nominal GDP. So the nominal GDP is the observed value that you and I will calculate when we go about understanding what is GDP, how much is India's GDP. But the real GDP is trying to figure out what happens if we take away the effect of prices and understand what is the real increase in the production of total economic output.
Okay, so if we follow this example, it's obviously much better if we produce more apples, right? Because otherwise what we're talking about is just inflation, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Exactly. So inflation is the effect that we take away from nominal GDP to arrive at the real GDP. Now, it's very important to understand that in common parlance, when we say that India's GDP has gone up by this percent or that percent, we are talking about real GDP because that is what economists care about. And that is what everybody should typically care about. But the observed value is always the nominal GDP. And often the bit of deriving the real GDP from the nominal GDP creates a lot of confusion and debate. But both nominal and real GDP have their own uses. Nominal GDP is the important thing for the finance minister to figure out how things will run. How much revenue will she get? How much money space she has in terms of borrowing and allocating resources for next year.
Right, and what particularly stands out right now is that India's real GDP is just 57% of the nominal GDP. I mean, that's a huge difference, right? Because it shows that we're not actually producing that many apples. It's just that the price of apples has gone that much more up.
Exactly. This is exactly the point to understand of how much is the difference between real and nominal, and people should appreciate what happens. And, don't forget that the last few years, we've seen a fair amount of inflation. We've seen a high inflation scenario where reserve banks have also tried to tamp it down by higher interest rates. And that is why you see more, a significant difference between real and nominal. And that is why the controversy last year, when the difference was shown to be lower, but everybody said that there's a lot of inflation.
And these current estimates show that India's real GDP has grown at a compounded annual growth rate of just 4.8%. Could you tell us what stands out to you about that figure?
So, see, typically an economy benefits from population. A high population or a big population means that there are more workers, there are more consumers. So, frankly, for a country like India, which is now the most populous country on the planet, at one level, it can be argued that we don't actually need the world to run our economy. Just the domestic size is so huge that if we were to produce for ourselves, and consume our own products, the momentum would be significant. Now, for an economy like India, for any economy, there is something called a potential GDP growth rate. Now, that is basically saying you can grow, that economy can grow at this level without stroking inflation, right? It's a normal. It's like saying, this is the speed at which you can run without sort of losing the ability to speak, that kind of a thing. Now, that potential GDP growth rate for India is around 6%. It used to be something like 7.5%, 8% in 2007-8 when we were growing really fast. It has come down, that ability to grow fast. The data is showing that we have grown at less than 5% over the last 6 years. So which means that we are not even, first of all, anywhere close to that potential growth rate. So that is a miss for India. The other thing is that for an economy this big, if you grow slower, you will not be able to create jobs and prosperity. The important thing to understand with these numbers is that often what happens is that if you look at just annual numbers, especially after the pandemic, because of the statistical illusion that was created in the data, that because of a low base effect, you had higher GDP numbers in percentage terms, often it can appear to people that there is some kind of a mystery. How is it that India is the world's fastest growing economy, and yet we have so much unemployment and youth is out on the streets, But if you look at the average number over a slightly longer period, over 5 years, 6 years, 10 years period, then the data shows that actually those are statistical illusions.
Right, because economies world over really took a hit during COVID. So if we compare what happened just after COVID to what happened during COVID, it seems like we grew by so much.
Yes. So if you look at the average number over a slightly longer period, you get a real picture where you understand that your economy is actually not growing that fast. So it would not be a surprise to know that if we are growing at less than 5% on an average basis, then that we are not creating as many jobs either in the government or outside the government, and that there's not as much prosperity as one would imagine to be if we were like growing at 9 or 8 or 10%. So it relieves the confusion in your mind of what is happening. The truth is that we are not growing as fast as we would like. Now, the whole idea about growing to become a developed country by 2047 requires us to grow at something like 9 or 10%. And we are growing at less than 5. So which means we are just about half of where we should be. That immediately makes it very clear of how far we are off the mark in terms of growing our economy and creating jobs and prosperity.
And basically, when we're talking about GDP and any kind of GDP, we are looking at all the money that is being spent in the economy, right? So let's begin by talking about the most common and direct way, which is personal spending. Now, we've talked about it in the past as well, that personal spending, the money that you and I spend, has been low for some time, right?
Yes, so this has been the biggest problem in most economies, and in particular in India's economy. What we spend, you and I spend in our personal capacity contributes 60% of India's GDP. So it's the biggest engine of growth, right? Which is to say that if we reduce our spending, even by a small amount, the rate at which we spend 1 year to another, then that will have a magnified effect on the overall GDP. Now, instead of just looking at the overall GDP numbers, which were in any case moderate, let's look at what is happening to the private spending. And there the data is quite stark. Over the last 6 years, since just before COVID, we have grown at an average annual rate of 4.8%. So if your biggest contributor to GDP is growing at 4.8%, it does two things. One, it impacts the growth at which the overall GDP will grow. And secondly, it reduces the incentive for businesses to invest in fresh capacity. Now, businesses investing in fresh capacity is the second biggest engine of growth. It contributes 30% of the GDP. So when people consume less or consume at a lesser rate, it not only depresses the overall GDP, but it also reduces the incentive for the second biggest engine to keep whirring, right?
Right. People in the private sector are like, why should I start a new factory or set up a new plant when people are just unlikely to buy those new products?
Exactly. So it also depresses that. So that takes care of almost 90% of India's GDP. So you can understand why both those engines are sort of holding back, and where can the solution come from? That's the real challenge for the government.
Okay, so we've spoken about personal spending and we've spoken about the private sector, but the third factor here is government spending. In fact, you point out in your piece that unlike normal people, government can actually spend more than what it earns. And the government can actually do a lot of things. It can spend money on capital expenditure. And we've spoken about this in the past, that has a multiplier effect, right? Because when you build a bridge, for example, you're not just giving jobs to people, but you're also creating infrastructure, which is an asset of its own. Why hasn't that been going up?
Well, part of the thing is to do with how much is it that the government can do. And there's only so much that a government can also do. I mean, to be fair to this government has been trying to switch its expenditure from revenue to capital, which is to say that it's trying to spend more on capital than previous governments, build more infrastructure, invest in that more. And in fact, the growth number on the infrastructure, on the investment spending is largely coming from the government spending on that. It's not so much the private sector. So if you look at just the private sector investments into the economy, they are much lower, even growing at even lower number. And a government has been trying to also curtail its own expenditure because it is hitting a barrier in terms of fiscal deficit or how much it can borrow. So there are constraints both on government side also as well as on the private sector side. One thing to understand in all of this is, again, we've discussed this in the past, what policies and what kind of a framework does the government choose? Like in the past, we've discussed about the call on corporate income tax, or we've discussed on GST. Now, GST or indirect taxes are regressive. 12% GST is 12% for everybody, both the poorest person and the richest person. Typically, you want a system where income taxes are high and the indirect taxes, the direct taxes are high, the indirect taxes are low, so that it's cheaper for people to buy stuff. So ideally, the government should be figuring out a way to reduce GST and increase direct income tax. Charge people who are actually rich directly instead of ruining the whole market by charging a lot of indirect taxes. So there is a genuine bind at the present moment of where the money can be spent. But I suspect the solution lies in the policy choice, tweaking the policy choices.
Right. And in this regard, even the decision to cut corporate income tax was another questionable move by the government. But the other factor when it comes to spending is exports. Can you tell us how India has been doing as far as exports are concerned?
So India has been struggling with exports. On an annual basis, somebody might be able to find some silver lining. But some time back, I did a piece which looked at a longer term view. And you find that over the last decade, we have sort of stagnated in our exports. We've really struggled. Part of that is to do with the fact that the global economy has sort of become more protectionist. More and more countries do not want to trade, The biggest economies, the US and some of the Western economies, they are now looking inwards, and that sort of holds back. But part of the problem is also that And actually a bigger part of the problem has to do with our own domestic efficiency. India has not been able to really become as efficient in producing goods as to dominate the world market. And that's why we lose out on different commodities to even countries like Bangladesh or Vietnam, much smaller countries. But they pick and choose what they want to do, and they do it much better than us, right? And we've been sort of looking at different directions, whether we can, join the global bandwagon. Can we actually enter the, global supply chain? So we've been struggling on the exports front. And the truth is that globally, it doesn't look like a scenario where the protectionism that we see is going to end soon. It looks like we are in for a slightly longer period where more and more countries will look inwards and dissuade trade. So the typically exports was a growth engine for many of the East Asian economies and Asian economies like Korea or China. That engine is not necessarily working in our favor right now. And it is made much, much worse by the fact that we ourselves are not as efficient. So that is a challenge still.
And next we talk about climate change. Last week, the World Meteorological Organization declared that 2024 was the first year to breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming mark, a key benchmark that scientists and climate activists have been discussing for years. According to data, the annual average temperature of Earth's surface last year was 1.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And what is particularly worrying is that this news came as a surprise to absolutely no one in the field. And this includes the Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who reports on climate change for the paper.
So what we have received, what we saw on Friday happening is a confirmation of something that was very much on the cards. It was estimated, it was very much expected. And that is what has happened. Not just one agency, but 6 different data sets have all said that 2024 was the warmest year. Not all 6 actually say that 1.5 degrees centigrade has been breached, but the cumulative analysis based from all these 6 data sets, it shows that the 1.5 degrees temperature threshold has actually been crossed. So this is what has happened. Now, as you pointed out earlier also, it's an important mark that's discussed very often in the climate change perspective. Also, it's a target mentioned in the 2015 Paris Agreement itself.
The Paris Agreement, as many of you would know, is the international climate treaty, the main goal for which has been to hold the global annual average temperatures within 1.5 degrees Celsius, with 2 degrees Celsius being the worst case scenario.
So it's an important threshold that was being tracked. Now, also for our listeners who have not followed the discussions, what are we talking about? What is this 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade that we are talking about? We all know that the global temperature is rising, and we take 1850 to 1900 period as the baseline. And the average temperature of the Earth during that 50-year period is what we consider the baseline, and it's called the pre-industrial average. And we are measuring temperatures from that pre-industrial average. And what we are seeing is that as the temperature continues to rise because of climate change, the idea was to restrict this temperature rise to as small a number as possible, as low as possible. So 2 of the thresholds that we keep talking about is one, that we should not allow the temperature rise to go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade from those pre-industrial averages. And the overall objective in Paris Agreement is also, 1.5 seems difficult, but we should never let it go beyond 2 degrees Celsius, right? So those are the thresholds that are mentioned. And what has happened now is 2024 is the first calendar year where the annual average temperature of the Earth has crossed 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Right, and Amitabh, these are just arbitrary numbers in that sense, right? It's just a way for us to have a target that, let's not let temperatures rise beyond this degree. Because in some sense, we are in uncharted waters. We have actually never been here before. So we don't actually know what's going to happen now.
Yes. So these are completely arbitrary thresholds that, the world decided on its own. There is no science behind these thresholds. The impacts of climate change progressively increase with the increase in temperature. And as the temperatures keep on increasing, these impacts, the kind of impacts that we are already seeing, they become more frequent and more severe. That's all. But there is nothing that gets triggered if we cross 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. So you are completely right. These are very, very arbitrarily defined thresholds that we, the world, decided to make these the stated goals of climate action.
And Amitabh, the other thing is that since this breach didn't really come as a surprise to anyone, I was wondering, what does that say about our climate change preparedness and our climate change response? Because this is yet another reminder that we are not doing enough, right?
So, we have failed completely, not allowing temperatures to go to 1.5 degrees. And again, I think before we get into the response measure, I think we should also clarify to our listeners is that, 1 year breaching 1.5 degrees Celsius target does not mean that the threshold has been permanently breached. And from the climate change perspective, the 1.5 degrees target or the 2 degrees target, they refer to long-term trends, meaning, trends which are spread at least over, 2 to 3 decades. Now, that means if over a 2 or 3 decade period, over the next, say, 15, 20, 30 years, if consistently the temperature, the annual temperature is above 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is when we'll say we have crossed the 1.5 degrees threshold. So if that happens, and there is this real danger of that too happening in the next 10-15 years. And that is what brings us to your question about, the global response, which has been extremely inadequate and which is allowing temperatures to increase steadily. Now, the only way to restrict these temperature rise is to drastically reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, which are supposed to be the main reason why global warming is happening. And if you look at the last few years or the last couple of decades when the world has been, at least talking about taking action, and there is this entire climate change architecture that has been put in place, there is the Paris Agreement, there have been other agreements in the past, all that has not resulted in any significant amount of emission cuts till now. In fact, emissions have still been rising. And if we continue to emit the way we were emitting earlier, then of course we are not contributing to solving the problem in any case.
Amitabh, it seems to me that the kind of response we require for climate change is the kind of response we saw for COVID. For COVID, and because people were immediately dying, everyone got together to ensure lockdowns and develop vaccines. And that was the last time we saw the world getting together to solve a problem. And it seems that has not really happened for climate change.
Well, your comparison with COVID, probably to the extent that climate needs to be dealt with the same kind of urgency that was shown in the case of COVID, that probably is definitely right, that we need to accord greater priority to dealing with climate change. I mean, it's not that big a priority as COVID was, and as you rightly say, mainly because you saw people dying immediately and there was this immediate existential threat. You see people dying in case of climate change as well, but somehow it doesn't seem that immediate. Also, even as we speak, there is this horrendous fire activity going on in California and US. So it's not that only certain kind of countries are getting affected. Almost everyone is getting affected. But somehow that immediacy about, or the fact that if we don't do anything, everyone is going to die, the way it seemed during COVID, that is not the case with climate change. And here it's more, at least in the bigger countries and more capable countries, it's not just about survival, it's also about competing against each other and winning and trying to protect their own interests and not doing more than the bare minimum that they can get away with. But there is a certain kind of distinction between the COVID situation and the climate change situation.
And in the end, we talk about the Hindu festival of Makar Sankranti or Uttarayan, which begins tomorrow. This is, of course, the harvest festival that is meant to symbolize a significant shift in the astrological and agricultural cycles and is observed throughout the country in honor of the sun god. The festival is celebrated with bonfires, regional delicacies, and of course, kite flying. Now in Gujarat, particularly Old Ahmedabad, this tradition has taken on a new twist with the rise of terrace tourism. For years, residents of Old Ahmedabad have rented out their rooftops to visitors looking to enjoy the festival. In recent times, however, this has evolved into a booming business as well. Travel firms now offer special packages that attract people not only from across the city, but also from other states and even abroad. Some terraces are so large that they can accommodate up to 50 people at a time, with some even catering to corporate clients looking for a unique and festive experience. In a recent report for the Indian Express, Parimal Dhabi writes that both individuals and travel firms are renting out their terraces for kite flying, with prices reaching up to 2,000 to 4,000 rupees per person. These terrace packages offer everything from delicious local food to hand massages for relaxation and even plastic horns to celebrate each kite victory. Now, the demand for these terrace rentals has surged in recent years. When Parimal spoke to Ajay Modi, a travel operator, Modi shared that he has rented out all 3 of his terraces and is now assisting other homeowners in renting theirs out as well. This trend not only seems to help preserve the heritage of Old Ahmedabad, but also provides an additional income stream for homeowners. To know more about the terrace economy, you can find Parimal's piece in today's episode description. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.